The dust of the Wyoming Territory had a way of getting into everything. A fine, gritty powder that settled in the folds of a worn dress, coated the back of a desperate woman's throat, and shrouded the future in a haze of uncertainty. For Sarah McKenna, standing on the warped planks of her porch with her daughter Emma clutched in her arms, the dust was a constant reminder of the barrenness that had claimed her life since her husband Thomas had been laid in the ground. But today, the dust was being kicked up by a different kind of trouble. Two men had ridden up to her small homestead, their horses looking as ill-tempered as their riders. They didn't bother with the gate, simply nudging their mounts through the sagging fence as if it were nothing more than a suggestion. Now they stood in her yard, their boots scuffing the dry earth, their presence a violation of the fragile peace Sarah fought so hard to maintain. The taller one, a man with a stained duster and a cruel twist to his lips, unrolled a piece of paper. Mrs. McKenna. He said, the title sounding like an accusation. We're here on behalf of Mr. Silas Blackwood. Just a preliminary survey of the property. A survey. Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Emma, sensing her mother's fear, whimpered and burrowed her face into Sarah's shoulder. There's nothing to survey. This is my land. For now. The second man chimed in. He was shorter, stockier, with eyes like chips of cold slate. He let his gaze drift from the peeling paint of the cabin to the meager woodpile lingering on the obvious signs of poverty, with a contemptuous smirk. Mr. Blackwood holds the note on this place. A sizable note, I hear. Just making sure his investment is sound. Their true purpose was as clear as the unforgiving sky above. They weren't surveyors. They were vultures sent to circle and intimidate, to remind her of her vulnerability. Silas Blackwood owned half of Cedar Falls, and what he didn't own, he controlled. Thomas, in his optimistic folly, had borrowed heavily from Blackwood, convinced a single good harvest would set them right. Instead, consumption had taken him, leaving Sarah with nothing but a mountain of debt and a baby to feed. You can tell Mr. Blackwood that his investment is as sound as my husband's word. Sarah set her pride a thin shield against their menace. The tall man chuckled a dry, rattling sound. Your husband's word ain't worth much from 6 feet under, ma'am. Mr. Blackwood prefers collateral he can see and touch. He took a step toward the porch, and Sarah instinctively tightened her grip on Emma, pulling her back. The air crackled with unspoken violence. The men didn't need to draw their guns. Their threat was in their posture, in the predatory gleam in their eyes, in the casual way they encroached upon her space. Sarah's mind raced, searching for an escape that didn't exist. She was alone miles from town, with no one to call for help. That's when a third horse appeared, cresting the low rise that led to the road. The rider moved with an easy, confident grace, his silhouette stark against the bleeding colors of the morning sun. He wasn't riding fast, but there was an authority in his approach that made both of Blackwood's men turn. As he drew closer, Sarah recognized him. Jacob Thornfield. The rancher whose land bordered hers, a man who owned more cattle than there were people in the entire county. He was a quiet, solitary figure in town, a man whispered about, but seldom approached, his wealth and self-sufficiency setting him apart. He reined in his magnificent bay horse a few yards from the fence, his pale blue eyes taking in the scene with a swift, assessing glance. Blackwood's men, their aggressive stance, and Sarah on the porch, her face pale with fear, clutching a shivering child. He didn't speak to the men. He addressed Sarah directly. "Morning, Mrs. McKenna. Everything all right here?" His voice was calm, a low rumble like distant thunder, but it cut through the tension like a knife. The tall man straightened up, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "This is private business, Thornfield." Jacob's gaze finally shifted to the man, and it was as cold and sharp as a winter frost. When two armed men are trespassing on a widow's property, it stops being private business and starts being my business. Now, unless you've got a deed in your hand that says this land belongs to Silas Blackwood, I suggest you get back on your horses and ride out. The men exchanged a look. Jacob Thornfield was not a man to be trifled with. He had built his empire from scratch, and the stories of his hardness were as well known as the stories of his wealth. More importantly, he was one of the few men in the valley who wasn't in Blackwood's debt. "We were just leaving," the stocky man muttered, already turning toward his horse. The tall one held his ground for a moment longer, his pride stung. "Mr. Blackwood won't forget this. You tell Silas I'm counting on it." Jacob set his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He dismounted with fluid grace, his eyes never leaving the two men until they had swung into their saddles and galloped away, leaving a cloud of resentful dust in their wake. Silence fell heavy and profound. The threat had passed, but its chill remained. Jacob walked toward the porch, stopping at the bottom step. His gaze softened as he looked at Emma, who had started to shiver, her thin cotton dress no match for the crisp morning air. "He sent them to scare you," Jacob stated. It wasn't a question. Sarah knotted her throat too tight for words. She felt a wave of delayed shock wash over her, her knees suddenly weak. "It won't be the last time," he continued, his eyes meeting hers. "Blackwood doesn't like being defied." He looked at Emma again, a frown creasing his brow. "That child's cold. You should get her inside." "Thank you, Mr. Thornfield," Sarah managed to whisper. "You didn't have to." "A good man once taught me you don't ride past trouble if you've got the means to stop it," he said, cutting her off. He gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable, and turned back to his horse. Sarah watched him mount and ride away, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. She didn't understand why he had intervened, but as she stepped back into the relative warmth of her cabin, one thing was terrifyingly clear. She was no longer just a widow struggling with debt. She was now caught in the crossfire of a conflict between two powerful men, and her small, fragile life was the battlefield. Dust settled like a shroud over Cedar Falls, a town held in the subtle but unyielding grip of Silas Blackwood's ambition. It wasn't a town of overt fear, not with gunfighters on every corner, but of a quiet, creeping corrosion of the spirit. Blackwood owned the bank, held the mortgages on half the businesses, and had the sheriff in his pocket not through bribes, but through the more insidious leverage of past favors and future prosperity. To cross Blackwood was to find your credit dry up, your supply wagons delayed your best ranch, hands suddenly offered better wages elsewhere. It was a slow strangulation, polite and merciless. Sarah McKenna felt that pressure every waking moment. The confrontation with Blackwood's henchmen had left a lingering poison in the air of her small homestead. She now saw threats in every shadow, heard menace in the whisper of the wind through the thin cabin walls. Her poverty was no longer a private struggle. It was a public vulnerability that Blackwood had seen and decided to exploit. She spent her days in a frantic race against destitution. She took in washing from the few townspeople not afraid to associate with her, scrubbing strange linens in a tub of harsh lye soap until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. By the dim light of a single kerosene lamp at night, she mended shirts and darned socks, her needle a tiny weapon against the encroaching darkness, her fingers growing stiff and calloused. For her own meals, she portioned out a handful of beans, chewing each one slowly, trying to trick her stomach into feeling full, while she mashed the rest with a little water for Emma. Her daughter was the sun around which her dark world revolved. Every sacrifice was for Emma, Every prayer whispered into the cold night air was for Emma's health, for her future, for a life better than this meager existence. But fear was a constant companion. Emma was too thin, her cries too weak. Sarah's own milk had all but dried up, another casualty of hunger and stress. Days later, with her food stores nearly gone, and the coins in her sugar tin dwindling to a few pennies, desperation drove her back into town. She walked the dusty main street, Emma bundled in a thin shawl on her hip, feeling the weight of curious and pitying eyes. She headed for Henrik's bakery, the scent of fresh bread, a cruel torture to her empty stomach. Henrik Olsen was a good man, his face perpetually dusted with flour, but he was also a practical man living under Blackwood's shadow. When Sarah approached the counter, his usual welcoming smile was strained. "Henrik," she began, her voice low. "I need a loaf of bread. Just one. I can pay you at the end of the week when Mrs. Gable pays me for her mending." Henrik wrung his hands in his apron, his gaze darting nervously toward the street. "Sarah, I can't. My credit ledger is full." Sarah knew it was a lie. She had seen him extend credit to others just last week. The truth was colder, sharper. "Has Mr. Blackwood spoken to you?" The baker's face fell, his eyes pleading for her to understand. "He just suggested it would be unwise for folks to be extending charity to those with unsettled debts. He said it was bad for the town's economy." It was a death sentence delivered with a smile. Blackwood was cutting her off, isolating her, making it impossible for her to survive. Her humiliation was so profound, it felt like a physical blow. She was about to turn away, to retreat to her cabin, and face the stark reality of having nothing when the bell above the door chimed. Jacob Thornfield stepped inside, bringing the scent of cold air and leather with him. He took off his hat, a fine black Stetson, its felt worn smooth from years of use, and nodded a greeting to Henrik. His eyes then found Sarah, and he saw it all in a single sweeping glance. The desperation on her face, the shame in her eyes, the way Emma shivered in her thin shawl. He didn't say a word to her. He walked to the counter and placed a silver dollar on the wood. The sound echoed in the silent shop. "A loaf of your best bread for Mrs. McKenna," he said to Henrik, his voice quiet but firm. "And a bag of flour, some sugar, and whatever else she needs. Put it on my account." Henrik's relief was palpable. He scurried to fill the order, eager to be out from under Jacob's steady gaze. Sarah found her voice a ragged whisper. "Mr. Thornfield, I can't." "You can," he said, turning to her. "And you will." He looked down at Emma, whose big brown eyes were fixed on him with solemn curiosity. The baby shivered again, a tremor that shook her small frame. Without a moment's hesitation, Jacob did something that made the whole town, watching through the bakery's large front window, draw a collective breath. He gently placed his expensive Stetson on Emma's tiny head. The hat was enormous, swallowing her whole, its wide brim falling down over her eyes. Emma, startled, let out a gurgle of surprise. Then her tiny hands reached up to pat the strange, heavy object. "Looks good on her." Jacob said, a flicker of something warm in his eyes. "I can't take your hat," Sarah protested, her cheeks burning. "A hat's got more use keeping a baby warm than sitting on my head," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's a gift, not charity." He was doing more than an act of kindness. He was throwing down a gauntlet. In a town where Silas Blackwood's displeasure could ruin a man, Jacob Thornfield had just publicly and unequivocally taken Sarah McKenna's side. The whispers that followed them out of the bakery were no longer just idle gossip. They were fearful, awestruck. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the jagged peaks in hues of blood and rust, a beautiful but unforgiving landscape that promised little to those without power. And Jacob Thornfield had just made a very public display of his. The men left. Silence fell, but the threat remained. The retaliation was not long in coming. It arrived 2 days later, not with the thud of henchmen's boots, but with the crisp official rap of Sheriff Brody's knuckles on her cabin door. Sheriff Brody was a man caught in the middle, his conscience and his pragmatism, in a constant, weary war. He held his hat in his hands, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. "Sarah," he began, his voice heavy with reluctance. "I'm sorry. I have to serve you with this." He handed her a folded document. Sarah's hands trembled as she took it. It was a foreclosure notice. The formal, unforgiving legal language spelled out her doom, the full amount of Thomas's loan, a sum so astronomical it might as well have been the moon, was being called in by the holder of the note, Mr. Silas Blackwood. She had 30 days to pay in full. After that, she and Emma would be evicted. 30 days. It was an impossible deadline, a hangman's noose disguised as a legal proceeding. "He can't do this," she whispered, the paper crinkling in her white-knuckled grip. "He can, Sarah." Brody said, his voice full of a pity she didn't want. "The note allows for it. It's all legal." He finally looked at her, his eyes apologetic. "It's the hat, isn't it? Thornfield made a stand for you, and now Blackwood is making one of his own." The news spread through Cedar Falls like a prairie fire. The townspeople now looked at her with a new kind of fear, not for her, but for themselves. She was a lightning rod, and no one wanted to be standing next to her when the storm broke. The few mending jobs she had dried up overnight. When she walked through town, conversations stopped and people crossed the street to avoid her. She was poison. For a week, pride kept her from Jacob Thornfield's door. She told herself she could solve this on her own, that she wouldn't be a burden. But as the days ticked by and her meager food supplies dwindled once more, the hollow ache in her stomach was eclipsed only by the terror of seeing Emma go hungry. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She walked the long miles to the Thornfield ranch, Emma asleep in her arms, Jacob's hat still perched on her head like a defiant crown. The ranch was an empire of rolling hills and sturdy fences, the main house a testament to years of hard work and success. It was another world from her own. Jacob found her hesitating by the gate, her courage failing her. He had been watching for her. "I expected you sooner," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm not here for a handout." Sarah said the words rushing out. "I need work, Mr. Thornfield. I'll do anything. I can cook, clean, mend. I know numbers. I can keep your books. I'll work off every cent of what Thomas owed." Jacob studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her fierce pride, the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, the sleeping child in her arms. "The debt is not your burden to carry, Sarah." "It is," she insisted, her voice cracking. "It's my husband's name, my daughter's future. I will not accept charity. Please, give me a chance to earn my way." He saw the unbreakable resolve in her eyes and finally nodded. "All right, Sarah. The ranch books are a mess. My foreman writes like a chicken scratching in the dirt. The job is yours if you want it." He paused, his expression serious. "But you should know by doing this, you're stepping deeper into my fight with Blackwood. He won't like it. He's already taking my home." Sarah replied, a bitter strength hardening her voice. "What else is there left for him to take?" And so Sarah's life found a new, strange rhythm. Each morning she would walk to the Thornfield ranch, leaving Emma in the care of the gruff but kind-hearted cook, a man named Jedediah, who had worked for Jacob's father. Jedediah, with his grizzled beard and surprisingly gentle hands, seemed to know all the secrets of the valley. He watched Sarah with knowing eyes and spoke of Blackwood with a deep, simmering hatred. Sarah spent her days in Jacob's study, a room filled with the scent of leather tobacco and old paper. She wrestled with the chaotic ledgers, her neat, precise handwriting slowly bringing order to years of ranching transactions. The work was a solace, a way to focus her mind on something other than the ticking clock of the foreclosure. In the evenings, Jacob would join her. They would work in comfortable silence, the only sounds the scratch of her pen and the rustle of him turning pages in a book. Slowly, tentatively, they began to talk. He spoke of the land, of the challenges of building his ranch from nothing. She spoke of Thomas's dreams, of the simple happiness they had shared before sickness and debt had stolen it all away. One evening, while sorting a box of old receipts, she found a packet of Thomas's papers he must have left at the ranch after a cattle sale. Tucked inside was a promissory note he had signed with Blackwood. But something was wrong. The interest rate was extortionate, far higher than what the bank charged, and a clause written in tiny, cramped script gave Blackwood the right to call in the full amount at his sole discretion. It wasn't a loan. It was a trap. He was set up to fail. Sarah said, her voice trembling with a cold fury. Blackwood never intended for him to succeed. He just wanted the land. Jacob came to stand behind her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. That's how Blackwood operates. He preys on dreamers. His hand was warm and steady, a small anchor in her swirling sea of anger and grief. We need to find a way to fight him, Sarah. Not just for your homestead, but for this whole town. As they pored over the documents, their heads bent close together under the warm glow of the lamp, they began to investigate. Jedediah, the old cook, would offer cryptic clues. Old man Blackwood was greedier than his son. He'd mutter, "Always cutting corners. Cost a lot of good men their lives, that did." His words painted a picture of a deeper, older conflict, a darkness that stretched back a generation. Sarah realized Jacob wasn't just helping her. He was fighting a war that had begun long before she ever arrived in Cedar Falls. And as the days grew shorter and the foreclosure deadline loomed, their shared purpose began to blossom into something more. A fragile, unspoken intimacy grew in the quiet hours of the night, a connection forged in a common cause, and the startling discovery that two lonely souls could find comfort in each other's company. The pressure from Silas Blackwood intensified, coiling around the town like a snake. He made a point of appearing whenever Sarah was near his presence, a constant chilling reminder of the power he wielded. He would tip his hat to her on the main street, his smile as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. "Mrs. McKenna," he'd say, his voice a silken threat. "I do hope you're enjoying your employment. A woman in your delicate position should be careful about the company she keeps. Reputations, you know, so easily tarnished." His veiled warnings only strengthened the bond between Sarah and Jacob. One evening, after a particularly unnerving encounter with Blackwood in town, the tension in Jacob's study was thicker than the cigar smoke that curled toward the ceiling. Sarah was staring at the foreclosure notice now pinned to the wall like a death warrant, the date circled in red. "There has to be something we're missing," she said, frustration lacing her voice. "Some leverage, some secret." Jacob rose from his desk and walked to the window, staring out into the blackness of the night. His reflection was a ghostly image in the glass, his face etched with a weariness that seemed to run bone deep. "The secret isn't in your husband's papers, Sarah," he said, his voice low and heavy. "It's in mine." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was one of profound, soul-crushing guilt. "I should have told you this from the beginning. My fight with Silas Blackwood. It didn't start with your hat. It started before either of us was born. He gestured for her to sit in the large leather armchair by the fire. He remained standing, pacing before the hearth like a caged animal. My father, Elias Thornfield, and Silas's father, Bartholomew Blackwood, came to this valley together. They were partners. They discovered a silver vein up in the Razorback Mountains and started the Blackwood and Thornfield Mining Company. For a time, they were poised to become the wealthiest men in the territory. He paused the firelight, casting flickering shadows across his face. My father was the miner. He understood the earth, the rock, the dangers. Blackwood was the businessman, the one who handled the money and supplies. My father started noticing things. Timbers that weren't the right grade, blasting powder that was cheaper, less stable. He warned Blackwood they were cutting too many corners, that the mine was becoming a death trap. Blackwood accused him of trying to slow down production, of eating into their profits. Jacob's voice grew thick with an old, inherited pain. Then came the collapse. A whole section of the main tunnel gave way. 14 men were killed. One of them was Bartholomew Blackwood. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Silas was just a boy. He arrived with a rescue party to see his father's body being carried out of the rubble. And my father was one of the few who survived. He'd been in a different section of the mine. Silas created a story in his head, a story that absolved his father of any blame. He decided my father had sabotaged the mine to take it all for himself. He spent his entire life believing that lie, nursing that hatred. He blames the Thornfield name for everything he lost. The revelation was staggering. It reframed everything. This wasn't about land or money. It was a deeply personal vendetta, a blood feud passed from father to son. Jacob, I'm so sorry. He shook his head, waving away her sympathy. The guilt of surviving when so many others died. It broke my father. He sold off his share of the claim for pennies and tried to make a go of it with cattle. He never spoke of the collapse again, but he carried it every day. He finally stopped pacing and looked directly at her, his eyes blazing with intensity. That hat Emma wears, it was my father's. He gave it to me the day I left home, told me to build something clean, something that came from the top of the earth, not the darkness beneath it. It's a reminder of his legacy and his failure. Sarah felt the weight of his confession settle over her. She now understood the quiet sadness in him, the world weariness that clung to him like a second skin. But there's more, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Your husband's loan note. I didn't buy it from the bank, Sarah. The bank wouldn't touch Thomas's loan because it was Blackwood's money. I bought the note directly from Silas. Sarah stared at him, confused. Why would he sell it to you? Because he thought he was setting a trap for me. Jacob explained, a grim look on his face. He knew my history, knew I couldn't stand by and watch him do to you what his father's greed did to those miners. He sold me the note knowing it would put me directly in his line of fire. He doesn't just want your land, Sarah. He wants to destroy me, and you are the weapon he chose to use. The truth was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She wasn't a bystander in his war. She was the battlefield itself. And Jacob had willingly walked onto that field to protect her. With the conflict now raw and personal, Blackwood abandoned all pretense of legal maneuvering. The threats escalated from veiled to visceral. One night a fire broke out in Sarah's woodpile, dangerously close to the cabin wall. Jacob and his ranch hands, who had been taking turns watching over her homestead, arrived just in time to beat back the flames before they could catch the dry timber of the house. Sarah stood clutching a terrified Emma, watching the orange glow dance against the night sky, the acrid smell of smoke filling her lungs. It was no accident. It was a message. A few days later, a portion of Jacob's fences were cut, and a small herd of his prime cattle were driven into a ravine. The financial loss was significant, but the intent was clear: to inflict pain to demonstrate that nowhere was safe. The townspeople hunkered down, their doors and windows shut tight. The conflict had become too hot, too dangerous. Jacob and Sarah were completely isolated, their fight now a matter of life and death. The town held its breath, waiting to see who would be left standing when the dust finally settled. The attempted arson was a turning point. The abstract threat of foreclosure had been replaced by the tangible fear of flame and violence. Jacob moved Sarah and Emma into the main house at the ranch, a decision born of grim necessity. The small guest room felt like a gilded cage, safe but suffocating. Sarah watched from the window as Jacob's men patrolled the perimeter, rifles at the ready. This was her life now, a prisoner of a war she had never asked to join. The shared danger stripped away the last of their reservations. In the hushed, watchful nights, they found solace in each other. They no longer spoke of ledgers and debts, but of fears and hopes. Sarah confessed her terror of failing Emma, of not being strong enough. Jacob spoke of the crushing weight of his father's legacy, of the ghost of the mine collapse that had haunted every success he'd ever had. "We have to end this, Jacob," Sarah said one night, her voice fierce. "We can't live like this. He's not just trying to ruin you anymore. He's trying to kill you." Jedediah was right. Jacob mused, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He said, "My father changed after the collapse. He became secretive. He locked away all of his old mining papers, said they were cursed." A spark of an idea ignited in Sarah's mind. "Where are they, those papers?" "In the attic, an old trunk. I haven't looked in it since he died." Armed with a lantern, they ascended the dusty stairs to the attic. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. In a far corner beneath a canvas tarp sat a heavy iron-strapped trunk. It was locked. After a tense search, they found a small rusted key hidden in the lining of an old coat hanging nearby. With a groan of protest, the lock turned. Jacob lifted the heavy lid. Inside, preserved in the dry, still air, was the life of Elias Thornfield before the ranch survey maps, geological charts, assay reports. And at the very bottom, a leather-bound journal. Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. His father's elegant script filled the pages detailing the daily operations of the mine. For the first several entries, the tone was optimistic, full of the thrill of discovery. But then it began to change. October 12th. Bartholomew insists on using pine supports for the eastern tunnel. I have told him repeatedly that only oak will bear the weight of the shale seam. He says oak is too expensive, that it cuts into our profit. The man's greed will be the death of us. October 19th. Confronted B. Again about the timbers. He produced an invoice for oak, a clear forgery. The man is a liar and a cheat. The new crew from back east doesn't know the difference. They are putting their lives in the hands of a man who values $1 more than a human soul. November the 2nd. The tremors have begun. Small but a clear warning. The ground is unstable. I have ordered the men to stay out of the eastern tunnel against B's direct orders. He threatened to have me removed as a partner. I told him I would rather be a poor man than a murderer. The final entry was dated the day before the collapse. It was written in a frantic, hurried scrawl. November 5th. He has locked me out of the supply office and brought in his own foreman. He is sending the morning crew into the eastern tunnel to chase the new silver seam. God help them. I have sent a letter to my darling Mary telling her everything. If something happens to me, the world must know that Bartholomew Blackwood is the architect of this disaster. I pray it does not come to that." They sat in stunned silence, the lantern light casting long dancing shadows around them. It was all there. The proof. Jacob's father wasn't a failure who had survived by luck. He was a hero who had tried to prevent a tragedy. Silas Blackwood had built his entire life, his entire empire of hatred, on a foundation of lies his own father had created to hide his guilt. "The letter," Sarah whispered. "Did your mother ever receive it?" Jacob shook his head, a look of dawning realization on his face. "She died a month after the collapse of a fever. She never even knew. The letter must have gotten lost, or perhaps my father hid it away with the rest of this, too ashamed to face the truth himself." They now held the one weapon that could destroy Silas Blackwood. Not a gun, but the truth. They took the journal to Sheriff Brody, laying it open on his desk. As Brody read, the color drained from his face. The conflicted, pragmatic lawman disappeared, replaced by a man who had finally been shown a clear line between right and wrong. "The foreclosure is tomorrow at noon." Brody said, his voice grim but resolute. "Blackwood plans to make a public spectacle of it on the town hall steps. I'll be there. And this time I'll be on the right side of the law." The day of the foreclosure dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the final act of a long and bitter drama. By noon, the main street of Cedar Falls was crowded. Silas Blackwood had made sure of it, spreading the word that justice would finally be served upon the delinquent McKenna property. It was to be his ultimate triumph, the public humiliation of both the woman who had defied him and the man who had protected her. Blackwood stood on the steps of the town hall, impeccably dressed, a smug proprietary smile on his face. He held the foreclosure deed in his hand like a trophy. "Citizens of Cedar Falls," he began, his voice smooth and commanding. "Today we witness the unfortunate but necessary conclusion to a sad tale of debt and irresponsibility. Mrs. McKenna, through poor judgment and a stubborn refusal of practical advice, has lost her home. A lesson for us all." He turned to Sarah, who stood at the bottom of the steps, her head held high, Emma in her arms. "Mrs. McKenna, do you have anything to say before I file this deed?" "I do," a voice boomed from the edge of the crowd. A path parted as Jacob Thornfield walked forward. He wasn't armed. In his hand, he held not a pistol, but his father's leather-bound journal. He stopped beside Sarah, his presence a silent wall of support, and faced Blackwood. "Before you talk of lessons and judgment, Silas," Jacob said, his voice ringing with cold, hard clarity, "perhaps you should learn the truth of your own family's history." Blackwood's smile faltered. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Thornfield. This is about a legal debt." "No," Jacob countered. "This has always been about a lie. The lie you've told yourself your entire life. The lie that my father was responsible for the mine collapse that killed your own." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. "It's the truth," Blackwood snarled. "Your father was a murderer and a thief." "My father was a hero," Jacob declared, his voice rising. He opened the journal. "And your father, Bartholomew Blackwood, was a greedy coward who killed 14 men, including himself, because he was too cheap to buy proper oak timbers for the mine." He began to read from his father's journal. He read the entries detailing the warnings, the forged invoices, the growing fear in Elias Thornfield's heart. With every word, Silas Blackwood's face grew paler, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The crowd listened, rapt and horrified, the town's founding myth being rewritten before their very eyes. Finally, Jacob read the last damning entry, his voice thick with emotion. He tried to stop him. He tried to save those men. He closed the book and looked directly at Silas, his eyes filled not with triumph, but with a profound, weary pity. Your entire life, your hatred for me and my family, has been built on your father's sin. He wasn't a victim, Silas. He was the villain. The truth landed with the force of a physical blow. Silas staggered back a step, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The foreclosure deed fluttered from his nerveless fingers and drifted to the ground. His power over the town, built on a foundation of lies and fear, evaporated in that single shattering moment. The whispers in the crowd were no longer of fear, but of contempt. At that moment, Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his hand resting on his pistol, his face set like stone. Silas Blackwood. He said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. I'm not arresting you for the sins of your father. I'm arresting you for your own. For the attempted arson of the McKenna homestead and for the willful destruction of Jacob Thornfield's property. Your reign in this valley is over. As the sheriff led the broken, unresisting man away, a profound silence fell over the town square. Then a single person began to clap. Soon another joined in, and then another, until the street was filled with a wave of applause, not for Blackwood's downfall, but for the quiet, steadfast courage of the man and woman who had dared to stand up to him. Jacob turned to Sarah, his face worn but clear. The shadows that had haunted his eyes for so long were finally gone. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his gaze falling to the sleeping child in her arms, her small face peaceful beneath the brim of the rancher's Stetson. The long, dark night was over. In the quiet aftermath, a sense of weary peace settled over Cedar Falls. With Silas Blackwood stripped of his power and facing justice, the town began to breathe again. The subtle web of fear and intimidation he had woven for years unraveled, and people started looking each other in the eye once more. Sheriff Brody, emboldened by his stand, began to clean house, rooting out the last vestiges of Blackwood's corrupting influence. For Sarah and Jacob, the victory was quiet and personal. The cloud of the past had lifted, leaving behind a clear, bright space in which to build a future. They stood together on the porch of her small cabin, the foreclosure notice now a meaningless scrap of paper used to light the morning fire. The land was truly hers, but it no longer felt like a place of solitude and struggle. It felt like a beginning. Months passed, and the harsh Wyoming winter gave way to a green and hopeful spring. Jacob and Sarah worked side by side, not as debtor and savior, but as partners. They repaired the fences, planted a new garden, and drew up plans to expand the small homestead, merging the best of her land with the resources of his. Their shared labor was a form of courtship, each nail hammered and furrow plowed, a testament to the life they were building together. The town, having witnessed their trial by fire, now embraced them, and the whispers of gossip replaced by nods of genuine respect. One clear, sunny afternoon, they rode out together, leaving Emma in the care of a delighted Jedediah. Their destination was the place where the shadows had begun the abandoned silver mine in the Razorback Mountains. The entrance was boarded up, a crude wooden sign warning away trespassers. A simple stone cairn stood nearby, a makeshift memorial to the 14 men who had lost their lives in the darkness below. Jacob dismounted and walked to the pile of stones. He stood there for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he did something that made Sarah's heart ache with love and understanding. He took the black Stetson from his head, the hat his father had given him, the symbol of a legacy of guilt and redemption, and placed it gently on top of the cairn. It was an offering, an act of forgiveness for all the ghosts of the past, including Bartholomew Blackwood. He was no longer bound by his father's hat. He was free. As they rode back down the mountain, the valley spread out below them, lush and full of promise. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. "The hat," Sarah said softly. "Emma will miss it." Jacob reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "We'll get her a new one with no ghosts attached, one that's just for her." He looked at her, his pale blue eyes clear and full of a love that needed no words. "Our children will have their own stories to write, Sarah. A new legacy." Sarah smiled, a secret, gentle curving of her lips. She brought his hand to her stomach, holding it there against her. "It seems," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, miraculous joy, "that they're already starting." Jacob's eyes widened in stunned comprehension, then filled with a light so bright it seemed to rival the sun. He pulled his horse to a stop, dismounted, and lifted her down from the saddle, swinging her around in a circle of pure, unadulterated happiness. Their future was no longer a matter of surviving the past. It was a living, growing thing, a testament to hope, a promise whispered on the Wyoming wind.